Welcome to Truth Sentinel, watching over the truth in the news. Anthony?
Scott, where are you?
I'm on the island of Mauritius.
Ah, Mauritius. What are you doing there?
I'm looking for things.
You're looking for things. Cryptic as always. These things wouldn't be connected to a plane by any chance, would they?
They would. Mauritius is actually one of the islands not too far away from Reunion. Do you remember where that flaperon turned up?
Ah, yes. Mm-hmm.
So it's in the same vicinity, off the coast of Madagascar. There's a Reunion, Mauritius, and a number of other islands. Rodriguez, I think, is another one where some debris was found. Mm-hmm. And so I thought, well, I'll come along to have a look at one of the beaches here, which had been reported in the news as a place where one person had found some debris, which they said was connected to Malaysia in some way. There was lots of bottles turning up with Malaysia written on them. So I thought, well, I'll just pick that as a beach since I'm only here for a short time. Just a couple of days. So I went and had a look at that beach today.
And how is it there?
First of all, I think I'm suffering from sunstroke because it took a while to walk there. It took about an hour to walk there and an hour to walk back. Maybe more than that. I got a bit lost. I actually looked at more than just that beach. The name of the beach is La Cambise. It sounds a bit French because the languages that are spoken here on this island are French, English, and Creole. And although La Cambuse is spelt La Cambuse, I actually found out it's called La Cambise after some weird discussions with my taxi driver.
Ah, yeah, the good old weird discussions with the taxi driver. So what did the taxi driver say to you?
Well, this was the taxi driver that picked me up from the airport, and he welcomed me to the island. I said I was looking for La Cambuse, and he said, "Oh, you mean La Cambise?" And then he said, he started telling me a bit about the island. Said, "Oh, actually, you own this island." And I thought, I didn't know I owned an island. And he said, "Oh, yeah, the British. It's owned by the British." And I immediately thought, "Oh my God, not another one of these islands that we, colonized and said there was ours." And then I just got to thinking. I didn't actually say this to the taxi driver because after his fond welcome, I didn't want to start getting all political on him, but I just think it's ridiculous that countries such as England, as Great Britain, colonized all these places, and that people still think we own them. I just think nobody really owns pieces of land anyway, and this is the cause of a lot of wars over the centuries, and I just still find the whole concept of people thinking they could go to places and ignore the people who were living there and just say that they owned it, and from that point on,
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And it is sad that there are still places around the world where the people are saying, "Well, you own us." It's just bizarre and crazy talk, yeah.
I felt a little bit of paranoia when I first arrived here as well. I felt like, because I stood out like a sore thumb, I did feel a little bit of it's like walking into a bar where you just weren't one of the locals and everyone was looking at you and muttering, and it could have been my paranoia though. I think I may be suffering from heat stroke.
So the piano player stopped playing and all the guys turned around from the bar, yeah?
Metaphorically they did, yes.
So listen, what's happening with these private searches? I guess it sounds like there are quite a few different individuals and organizations participating. Can you tell me about any of them? Well,
I know Blaine Gibson, who's found multiple parts of the plane or debris. He's around these parts somewhere. I know he moves around between Madagascar and some of the islands, and he's found some parts.
He's an American lawyer, isn't he? And he's basically spent the last year on the search for MH370 wreckage. Is that right?
That's right, yeah. And I think he's responsible for finding things like the Rolls-Royce parts that had the RR logo on it. And yeah, he's devoted a lot of time to looking for parts. And the families recently came over and they've started looking in Madagascar, on the beaches of Madagascar, and also they recently left Mauritius, literally a couple of days. So I missed them. Otherwise, I would have gone and said hello to them.
I heard that there was at least one find on Madagascar. A Chinese man who was a relative of a passenger found some suspected MH370 debris there on Madagascar. And unfortunately, it seems that he has handed it over to the Malaysians, which I feel is maybe not the best idea. I don't know at this point in the search.
Well, I think it's fair to say there's a very negative view of the Malaysian search team, or at least some parts of them. I mean, after the families came here, it was discovered that some of the parts that had been found, some of the debris that had been found 6 months ago, still hadn't been collected by the Malaysians. And as soon as the families turned up recently, suddenly they quickly sent someone over and said, oh, yeah, we planned to send someone over all along. And, yeah, we're a little bit late. 6 months, that's it's kind of inexcusable. And it does seem that the Malaysian authorities just don't seem to care about any of this debris whatsoever. I mean, remember the flaperon that was found as well by the French? Mm-hmm. That has still not been handed over to the official search team, it's all very odd. I think this may be where some of the conspiracy theories are stemming from, is that there's just so many weird things going on with this story.
So do you think that's why there are so many kind of private individuals getting involved in the search? Is it something about a lack of confidence in the official search?
I think that's definitely part of the reason. Lack of the confidence probably isn't the word. I mean, I think there's just no confidence whatsoever. Yeah, and also people, they do want to find out what happened to this plane. Everyone's interested in a mystery, and people like to find out the truth. And I think, it's quite a noble effort that some people are involved in to go and look for things, but also I'm sure it provides them with some purpose, because it's quite an interesting thing to get involved with, trying to solve a mystery.
Yeah, very true. And I think possibly even more so for the relatives, where it's not really about a mystery. It's a little bit more personal, yeah. Absolutely,
yeah. For them, I know. I've heard from some of the families that are searching. It's been a very emotional journey. So much harder for them, yeah.
Okay. There's also been some controversy recently over the issue of marine fouling. Can you tell us what marine fouling is and what the controversy has been about?
Well, originally, yeah, these barnacles, these Lepus barnacles, I think they're called, they were all over the original flaperon that was found on Reunion Island, and which suggested they'd been submerged in the sea for a long period of time. As you would probably expect. And then there's some of the other debris that was found later had none of these barnacles on them. And, people questioned as to why there was no barnacles.
So marine fouling, this kind of these parts becoming encrusted in sea creatures and other things, this is something that typically happens to objects that are in the sea for a while, is that right?
I believe so, especially if they're submerged underwater for a period of time. I believe that these barnacles will attach themselves to these pieces and give an indication as to how long something's been in the sea. I can say by looking around the beaches today, the ones I went to in Mauritius, now there are some beaches surrounded by reefs, and I do feel that those reefs probably protect or act as an obstacle for any debris that might be coming from a crashed plane, for example. But I did go to some other beaches as well nearby, really, really treacherous beaches with huge rocks and huge waves crashing over them, somewhere where you certainly wouldn't consider swimming at all. And I felt like that was a more likely place for debris to be found. And I did find definitely some debris there, but not necessarily from the plane, obviously. But one thing I noticed, searching all the beaches I went to today and yesterday, and I searched quite a number of beaches, I didn't find one thing, and I'm not joking, I didn't find one thing that had been washed up by the sea that had a barnacle on it, not one.
Do you think that these may have been things that were just in the sea for too short a period?
What I think is I'm a bit surprised, because some of the stuff I saw, I mean, if you walk back from the beach, there would still be stuff that had been washed up from, a few months ago or a year ago even, and I couldn't find one thing that was that had a barnacle stuck on it anywhere. And another thing I'd like to say was not only could I not find stuff that had washed up that had barnacles on it, but there was a real lack of anything that had been washed up by the sea along these beaches. Now, some of them are obviously public beaches, but I would like to add this place is very deserted. I was coming here expecting there to be holiday makers, and it's really not like that at all. It's a very, very deserted place. I mean, the public beach I went to today, which is not one of the most accessible, and you wouldn't expect to find many people, and there was probably about 30 people in total, and it was a long, long beach. The ones I went to with the treacherous rocks, there was absolutely nobody there, apart from the occasional fishermen. And some of the beaches, there was nobody at all. And, no debris at all being washed up by the sea, which I found just kind of a bit odd. The reefs could explain some of that, but the ones with the beaches with the rocks didn't really have a reef so much protecting anything coming from the sea. It just didn't seem like anything. Most of the stuff that I found, the debris, and I did take some photos of that, I think was probably local debris. Maybe people had left stuff by the sea, it had gone into the sea and come back in again, but hadn't really gone very far. It just didn't seem to be one of those places. And Mauritius is in the same region as Reunion Island and Rodriguez Island, where this stuff was found. So I imagine they're quite similar. So I found that a bit odd.
So listen, we've both been trying to follow the complex ins and outs of MH370 pretty much since the plane disappeared. But I would say you in particular, even more so than me, I think. So finally, I just want to ask, after everything you've read and heard and everything you've seen, do you have a kind of leading theory as to why the plane went down?
I definitely think there's some kind of cover-up going on, possibly by the Malaysian authorities, but perhaps by other countries outside the Malaysian authorities, and the Malaysians are either participating with that or are just clueless about what's going on themselves. I think, and this is just an opinion, I suppose connected to some of what's gone on, I think a shoot down, either accidentally or deliberately, as part of a military exercise, may have been one of the reasons. I do think we have to consider the Inmarsat data to be incorrect. That has to, because a lot of the theories are negated by the Inmarsat data. So if we're gonna follow the Inmarsat data, then it crashed into the ocean basically, and debris washing up is from the search area. I do find it surprising it hasn't been found. I really do think in this day and age a Boeing 777 cannot crash into the sea and just disappear. I find that difficult to buy that. In fact, I find it difficult to buy that it disappeared at all. I mean, the official story is that Malaysia were tracking this plane. They knew it had switched off its transponder, and they decided that it was not a hostile threat. I've always found that really very odd. In this day and age of terrorism, that they had a plane that had gone missing, that had switched its transponder off, which they were tracking, and they decided, no problem, and they let it fly off into the middle of nowhere, where they couldn't track it anymore.
And this was at a time when a lot of sensitive things were occurring. There were military exercises going on. I think it was if anything, there was a lot of things going on at the time which I think would have tended to make the aviation authorities more cautious, not less.
Exactly, yeah. So I find from the very beginning some odd things have occurred, and then there was the visit by Obama to Malaysia, something that hadn't happened for decades, the US president visiting Malaysia. Suddenly he wants to visit. And then he's all kind of sympathetic to the families. A week later, he's given an after-dinner speech and jokes about the MH370, which makes me wonder, could this apathy by the Malaysians and the jokes by Obama be because they know what really happened? And so as far as they're concerned, it's been dealt with. I think a hijack scenario is very likely as well as the second hypothesis, that somebody took over the plane either from the EE bay that Jeff Wise mentioned or some other way. I do think it was a deliberate act because of the reasons we mentioned in one of our previous episodes about the time it occurred. So I think it could be a hijack that possibly went wrong. Or, there's some wild conspiracies, but I'll still entertain them. I think we have to consider the really unlikely situations as well, and still leave them on the table, because this is a very unusual story.
It is a very unusual story.
And then there's, of course, the Boeing uninterruptible autopilot, which is kind of been hushed up, but does exist. You can actually just Google it. It's on Wikipedia. Which, if you look at the Able Danger channel, they often talk about this, but it's possible to take over a plane. It was actually installed by Boeing themselves as a way to, take over a plane if it had been hijacked, and try and take control and take it somewhere safe. So there are ways to control the plane from the ground as well. So yeah, we've looked at a lot of the scenarios, but we're still not that much closer to finding out the truth. I hope something washes up or somebody speaks so that we can take another step on the journey to finding out the truth.
Yeah, me too.
I feel like there's definitely secrets, and I hope they are found out by us all. But I hope we can be part of that in some way of trying to find out what happened.
Well, I hope so too. Good luck with the rest of your time in Mauritius, and I'm hoping now we'll get to hear from Jeff Wise, yeah?
Yeah, we're going to have Jeff on soon, and we're going to talk to him about what he considers to be the developments since we last spoke.
All right, Scott. Well, I'll talk to you very soon. I guess by the time we speak again, you'll be in Ukraine, yeah? So I'll talk to you there and then. Okay, excellent. Thanks a lot. Bye. Bye-bye. So I was going to start, Jeff, by just asking you a question I've asked before, considering we've had a few chats, usually about a year apart. And I was just going to ask you, how much nearer do you think we are since our last chat, about a year ago, to knowing what happened to MH370?
Well, I feel that, I feel that it hasn't been pinned down completely, but I think we've very much narrowed down the list of possibilities, really to only two things. And I think one of those things is much stronger than the other. I wouldn't say that it's an open and shut case at this point, but I think it will be an open and shut case in the near future. And that once it's completely, satisfied to everyone's, once it's established to everyone's satisfaction, what happened to the plane, we'll be able to look back and say, we narrowed in on it progressively, and ultimately we're able to determine what happened. So I'm pretty optimistic in short.
That does sound optimistic. That's good. And I mean, I'm sure you've got a few theories on the table still. Originally you wrote a book, and your theory was about the possible northern route to Kazakhstan. Do you still think there's a possibility that could be the case?
I think that is almost certainly the case at this point. I mean, the failure of the seabed search. Remember, they spent $150 million or so to search the seabed where the plane would have gone if the Inmarsat signal data was correct and was correctly interpreted. The plane was not there. And so this raises a huge question. Why wasn't it there? How can we explain the mysterious absence of this plane from the seabed where the mathematicians assured us it would be? And in order for that to happen, you either have to have misinterpreted the data, which I don't think they did misinterpret it, or the data has to be wrong. There's a slight chance that the probability distribution that the mathematicians calculated was correct, but that the plane, just by an incredible twist of fate, happened to be outside the 97% probability area. I think it's much more likely that the data was inaccurate, was spoofed.
So you mentioned recently on your website that after the search finished, the search authorities started talking about the adjacent area. Yeah?
Right.
So the original search area was 120,000 square kilometers, and the adjacent area which they're now focusing on, is only 10,000 kilometers squared.
Right.
But they say they're not going to search it. Why aren't they going to search it?
As the end of the 120,000 square kilometer search area was coming into sight, and it had been pretty clear to a lot of people for a long time that the search was going to fail. The nations responsible for the search got together and decided that in the eventuality that they don't find the plane in this first area, they won't, unless they have really compelling specific evidence about exactly where the plane is, they're not going to look any further. And this was in part because the assurances that had been made by the Australians prior to that point were so strong. They said it is in this area. There's a 97% chance it's in this area. We're going to find it. We've got the champagne on ice. Trust us. It's going to be here. And so when they then said, well, no, okay, so it wasn't there. It's in the next area. Trust us. I think it was like the boy who cried wolf. Their credibility had been somewhat shot at this point. And frankly, if you look at their logic for why they think it's in this other area, it's not very solid. The area is much wider than one could plausibly assume that the plane could get from the seventh arc under the conditions that they assumed prevailed at the end of the flight, namely that the plane was in a very steep plunge. And most of this area has been searched already, so it really strains credulity to think that there's a good case that this plane would really be in this last 25,000 square kilometer area. Which, by the way, even after they announced this area, they had ships on location and they weren't searching it. So it kind of raises the question: well, how serious were they about this new area if they didn't take the opportunity to search it when they could have?
But in the first principle review report, it says that, and this is a quote again from your website.
Sure.
If the plane isn't in that adjacent zone, then quote unquote, this would exhaust all prospective areas for the presence of MH370.
Right.
And the way I understand that statement is, if it isn't in the adjacent area, then the plane isn't anywhere, which is an extremely strange statement to make.
Well, yeah. I would translate it a little bit differently. I think what they're saying is we have no idea where it is. But, and then reading between the lines even further, I would interpret it as saying we refuse to even acknowledge the possibility that the Inmarsat data was spoofed, that the satellite data unit had been tampered with, that the plane might have gone north.
Why have they refused to consider that?
I've asked them point blank twice, and their response is, we have the data that was given to us, and that's it. It's perplexing to me. I mean, it must have crossed their mind. I mean, they've have to have heard what I've been writing over all these years. They have directly rebuked and rebutted other independent researchers who have written on the topic, and have written inaccurately, and they've taken the time to say, no, this person is wrong. They've never done that to me. They've never said to me, look, we've analyzed the way the equipment is set up. It couldn't have been spoofed in the way that you propose. They haven't said, look, the route that the BTO data implies that the plane would have taken on a northern route is impossible because it goes directly over like an Air Force base or something. Nothing. They've never given any explanation why they won't consider it. And I think maybe it's because it would be highly embarrassing to them if it turned out that they spent all this money and refused to consider the possibility that it was all wasted.
Do you think it's a kind of case of anything where people are looking for a cover-up or anything like that is considered a conspiracy theory, and nobody really likes going into that kind of area?
Well, it occurred to me, if you remember the case where Obama said about Assad, that if Syrian government forces use chemical weapons, that's a red line. We're going to drop the hammer on you.
Yeah.
And then it turned out that they had used chemical weapons. This information came forth through public crowdsourcing. And the United States was put in an incredibly awkward position where they had to respond to the situation that they really would rather have ignored. And it has occurred to me that if it did turn out that Russia had deliberately murdered this plane full of civilians, it would require a response. And indeed, 4.5 months later, a very similar thing happened where a sister ship of MH370 was rather blatantly shot down. There was only a very tiny fig leaf of deniability that the Russians deployed in that case. They still got the sanctions, but the West was forced to act. The United States was forced to act with sanctions. I mean, not as an act of war. So the question is, why would Australia, the United States, wish to cover up essentially the possibility that the Russians had been involved in the disappearance of MH17? And the short answer being that they would not wish to be forced to respond, that they didn't wish to engage in a military confrontation with Russia. And as with the Syrian Red Line over chemical weapons, they would be happier just to let it slide.
I remember asking you before about whether you thought there was a link between MH17 and MH370. I think you said no, but I think on your website you mentioned that although it seems to be pointing towards the Russians and even naming a particular Russian involved,
right,
that there's still no clue as to the reason why they'd want to shoot down a Malaysian airliner. And so then I thought, well, if there's no reason for that one, could it not be linked to the same reason that if the Russians were involved with MH370, could there not be a link between the reasons for both of the incidents?
Well, I think you might have misunderstood what I said before. I've always thought that there was a link between MH370 and MH17. From the very early days when I began contemplating possible Russian involvement in MH370, one of the major questions, one of the major flaws really of the hypothesis was what would be the motive of the Russians to do this. And when MH17 happened, the absence of motive, again, seemed to link, in a sense, the two acts, in that MH17, there is no motive, and yet there is very powerful and compelling evidence that this was a deliberate act by the regular Russian army, by the Russian military establishment, by the Kremlin, essentially, because you have a piece of equipment that is crewed by Russians, is brought to Ukraine under the direction of the GRU, is deployed under the direction of the GRU, and is shoots down the plane and then is immediately brought back across the border. So this has all the hallmarks of a deliberate act, in my estimation. And yet again, we still don't have a motive. One can hypothesize something about a show of force or some kind of tit for tat in response to the imposition of sanctions, but nothing really stands out as obvious. And so for all those people who said, I don't think the Russians could have done it because they didn't have a motive, I said, well, they did do MH17 and there's no clear motive there either. So in a way, that eases the problem of the motive for MH370.
Okay, fair enough. And I mean, we're going to have to. Everyone's going to ask about the debris then. The obvious question is, what about the debris? And I know that you've received some criticism for saying Blaine may have planted debris. Do you think he could have been unknowingly finding debris that someone else could be planting it?
Right. So in order for this Russian hypothesis to hold any water, one would require that a Russian agent or someone connected to the Russians planted this debris in the southern Indian Ocean. The question becomes, was anybody with Russian connections somehow in any way tied to the planting of the debris? Well, it turns out that most of the debris that was found in the southern Indian Ocean was found by a guy named Blaine Allen Gibson, who has spent the last 30 years eyeball deep in Russia, speaks fluent Russian, has been living with a domestic partner who is Russian. And so, the debris was found by somebody with very strong Russian connections. That seems to me to be an extraordinary coincidence.
Although the flaperon was one of the first pieces found, wasn't it? And that was found washed up in the beach.
The flaperon was not discovered by Blaine Allen Gibson. However, there are numerous inconsistencies regarding the flaperon. Most notably, the distribution of the barnacles on the flaperon do not match how the flaperon was found to have floated by the French authorities. So that to me is itself a red flag. But if most of the pieces of debris were collected by someone with deep Russia ties, and presumably were essentially planted by him as part of his mission for the Russians, then it doesn't matter if some of them, we don't know where they came from or how they wound up. If only one of these pieces turned up under suspicious circumstances, then all of them are suspicious.
I wanted to mention actually as well that in Mauritius, when I was in Mauritius, I went looking just to see if I could find some pieces as well, and I walked a fair few miles along the coast of Mauritius, in a place where people have said that they'd found potential bits from Malaysia, and I was struck by how completely empty the beaches were. There was literally nothing for miles and miles. The only places you could find potential debris washed up from the sea were in the rocky areas, and
right.
There was no. I just wanted to let you know that there was not one barnacle anywhere that I could see, not a single barnacle. So even on stuff that had been washed up, there was no barnacles, and there are reefs protecting some of these islands. I was actually on Mauritius, but I thought that was interesting. That I don't know what. It would be interesting to go to the beach where the flaperon was washed up to see whether anything else there has any barnacles on it washed up from the sea, because there certainly wasn't anything where I was.
Yeah, I think it can depend on the tides. It can depend on the current. I don't think Mauritius would be necessarily, although pieces have been found there, that would necessarily be the most likely place. If you imagine a raft of debris kind of moving like a swarm of bees across the ocean, it would pass through Mauritius, but then move on, and maybe some of it would be caught in these gyres, and then pieces would get spit out. But the most of it would turn up in places like the eastern coast of Madagascar and the coast of southern Africa. It's interesting when you find a piece of debris on a beach, you don't really know where it came from. A lot of stuff, especially on a continent, you've got rivers that are carrying stuff out from deep in the interior, and they might sort of skirt along the coast and then come ashore. You might have fishermen in offshore boats, even vacationers might leave stuff on the beach. The percentage of stuff that actually is sourced from the deep ocean, that maybe fell off a ship or came from a crashed plane, or maybe in the case of the tsunami, a lot of stuff was washed into the sea in Japan and went all the way across the Pacific and came ashore on Alaska. Now, that stuff that's been at sea for many months is going to have a lot of barnacles and growth on it. There was some interesting research has been done involving pumice stones, which are spewed out of volcanoes, which sometimes happen in places like Tonga, and they form these huge rafts of pebbles that float. And they're very interesting for scientists to study because when they enter the water, they're essentially sterile. They've been formed by red hot magma. And so when they come ashore, scientists know exactly where they came from and how long they've been in the ocean. And these things tend to have almost always significant growth of marine life, whether algae, barnacles, and so forth.
I was going to ask you whether you ever found that I think it was the Rolls-Royce emblem. Did you ever find that a bit suspicious, how it was found without the barnacles? Then you reported about that, and then they showed a picture of it with the barnacles. Yeah.
Lo and behold, I mean, I found that extremely suspicious, and so I immediately tried to track down the retired. I think he was a doctor who had found this thing on his morning constitutional, taken a picture of it, forgot about it, and then saw the news report months later and said, "Oh, I think that looks familiar to me." The guy seemed completely on the up and up. I mean, if I wasn't of an extremely suspicious mindset at this point, I wouldn't have thought twice about it. The story seemed very plausible. But yeah, again, I mean, the timing was absolutely mind-boggling. And remember that these pieces are extremely few and far between. Nobody except for Blaine Allen Gibson has ever found one of these things intentionally. Nobody's ever gone looking for them and found them, except for this guy who's found a ton. All of them look the same. None of them have any marine life on them. They all fit in a suitcase. He finds them under extraordinary circumstances. One time he was walking along a beach. Didn't find anything. He went back, and there it was. A half an hour later, it had washed ashore and was sitting there on the beach. And there was a camera crew there to record it. So, anyway, you know, every springtime in South Africa, they do a beach cleanup, and they get 20,000 people out on the beach to clean up the beach and take all the garbage away. And since MH370 disappeared, they've put out a flyer to all the volunteers saying, hey, by the way, this plane went missing. Keep an eye out for any parts. It might look like this or like this. They've never found anything. None of these people that have fanned out across the beach, 20,000 people, none of them's found anything. Meanwhile, Blaine Allen Gibson can go out and almost at will find pieces.
So I wanted to ask, if these parts are planted, where do you think they're coming from? Do you think they are actual parts of MH370 that have been planted, or do you think they're parts of another 777?
No, the idea would be that the Russians took MH370, they have it, and then when it came time to convince people that the plane really did go to the south, they pulled some pieces off. Some of them I think they put in the water for time. They might have just taken a whole bunch and just chucked them in the ocean to let people find them when they would. And then the others they just kind of handed to Blaine. I mean, quite a few of them looked obviously heavy weathered. They very much look like they've been at sea for a while. Others look completely unweathered. Like no marine life, no even kind of abrasion or, when things are in the water for a long time, they get kind of like worn down. But some of these things look very pristine.
I also wanted to mention, I think we should probably get on to the Northern Corridor soon, but
sure.
But I also wanted to mention a bit of an outlier theory. I don't know if you ever heard this news story. It was bizarrely low key. In 2014, in Tripoli, Libyan rebels seized 11 airliners from Tripoli airport, and they essentially disappeared.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I really cannot understand why this is not a huge story, because, in our kind of post-September the 11th world, airlines disappearing, being stolen by a group of people who you could call terrorists, should surely be a huge story, right? But it was reported for a few days, and the story has disappeared as surely as the airliners. But I know. But it just made me wonder. I mean, all of the airliners they stole are Airbus airliners, not Boeing.
Really?
But it just made me start to wonder: is it possible that you could take pieces from another airliner and kind of and plant them on the assumption that, okay, most of the people who find these are not going to be experts, and they might be kind of close enough to looking right that they would fool all of the people some of the time, or some of the people all of the time. What do you think?
Well, Malaysia just published a report analyzing a number of the pieces that have turned up in the last year or so, and most of them, as you say, are not specifically linked to the MH370 airframe. So they could have come theoretically, if you're open to the idea of planting, they could have come easily from a different Malaysian airliner or a different 777. There were a couple of them, including the flaperon, of course, that had identifying numbers on them and can be positively linked to MH370. As I said, I mean, I find the people who would be most strongly motivated to plant debris are the people who actually have the plane. And so some people have speculated, well, maybe the Malaysians wanted people to stop wondering about it, and so they put other debris there. It's possible, but again, I mean, I don't think it's necessary.
One more question. There was a documentary aired on, I think it was Australian TV recently, which also called the official scenario into question in a different way.
Right.
They suggested that the steep dive would cause a big debris field, and
Right.
since the big debris field was not found, then we need to consider a much shallower controlled descent, because
Right.
a shallower controlled descent would result in the plane largely staying intact and then sinking to the bottom. Do you think that's
Right.
also a possibility?
No, I don't. I think that documentary was ill-informed. If it's one I'm thinking of, I think they cited an expert who was absolutely convinced that based on photographs he'd seen that the flap run must have been deployed, or the flap had been deployed downwards, which means that somebody was trying to ditch. I don't think there are people who are active in the MH370 research scene who are completely convinced that the plane ditched. When you look at how small the pieces are that, say, for instance, Blaine Allen Gibson has found, if you look at the small scrap of the vertical stabilizer that turned up, now that's the part of the plane that's least likely to suffer any damage in any kind of belly landing, whether it's high speed or low speed. You might remember the famous image of Air France 447 with the divers climbing on the tail fin of that Airbus plane. And you've got small pieces of the interior even, and so it to me very much looks like a very high speed, high energy impact. If we're talking about if that's what really happened.
There's also of course, the difficulty of ditching on the open ocean. I don't know if you've seen the footage, you probably have, of the Ethiopian airliner, which ditched.
Sure.
Yeah. And that was a very much a controlled descent, although under very difficult circumstances. And yet, the moment it hit, of course, the engines go under the water first, and the plane just broke up quite violently. So I think.
Yeah, you really have to ignore the Inmarsat data, where the authorities are now saying that the only interpretation that the only sense that they can make of the final BFO values is that the plane was in a steep and accelerating dive, and also the evidence of the debris. And the final report from the Australians made the case that the condition of the debris is such that the plane came apart into lots of tiny pieces. And they even went so far as to say that given the nature of the pieces we've found so far, there must have been a very large debris field as a result of this. And therefore, the plane couldn't have hit the ocean north of 30 degrees south, because that area was scanned quite intensively by airplanes during that first month, and they would have seen it. So it must be further south than 30 degrees south latitude. So
this is all leading, I think, to the idea that we do need to consider again the northern corridor.
Right.
I strongly agree with you about this, and I always have. I do think that it was dismissed far too quickly. So if the northern corridor is to be considered now, what should we do about that? Where should we start looking, and what hope do we have for finding the plane?
Well, I think just the first thing would be for the authorities to seriously engage with the idea that, look, the satellite data unit was tampered with. There's no accidental way, plausibly, that this could have happened. Somebody clearly was fussing with the electronics of the plane in a way that really demands some attention. I mean, rather than just ignore it and just to sort of shrug their shoulders, they should say, could this have happened? And if so, what would be the consequences? That would change the entire dynamics of the search to a tremendous degree, and I think allow real resources to be brought to bear and to look at questions of, for instance, is the route that we would then suppose ruled out by, for instance, primary radar collection by the countries that the path goes over, such as India, and China. And having looked at the issue with my limited resources, to me the answer is no, that these places are probably not surveyed during the late post-midnight hours. And but if that were to be the case, that would be good to know. I mean, these questions could be asked. I'm not claiming that I have definitive solution to this mystery at this point, but it does seem to me that there's a very glaring omission. And simultaneously, I would add one of the characteristics of this case that bears mentioning is the huge swarm of, let's call them conspiracy theories, that have just erupted around this case from day one and which continue to erupt. There's a very large community of people who never change their opinions, never really contribute anything really useful, who are constantly spouting misinformation. And it's not clear what their motives are or what their intent is. Now, I don't think there's ever been a case which was so completely swaddled in nonsensical theories. Now, in the case of TWA 800, there were quite a few people who believed that the plane had been shot down. There are other cases where planes have gone missing or come to grief, and people have said, well, they actually were shot down. But that's one theory. We have dozens, maybe hundreds of theories about MH370, most of which really create more noise than light. And if you look at MH17, you see the same phenomenon, but much more clearly, where you have Russia, the state of Russia is clearly promulgating a large number of entirely fabricated and bogus theories to try to cloud the waters about what happened to this plane. And so when we dial back from MH17 to MH370 and say, why is there so much noise and obfuscation around this plane? Why are so many people just totally clouding over the issue? And to me, it would also seem consistent with a case in which the Russian GRU probably, or some other branch of their intelligence community, is trying to confuse and baffle, which is something we have seen over and over and over again in what is undeniably at this point a consistent, wide-ranging offensive by Russia against the West to undermine to undermine Western liberal democracy by what they call hybrid warfare, confusion, the dissemination of misinformation, tampering with the election process. We're just as we speak, there is a testimony going on by the director of the FBI here talking about the ongoing investigation into what members of the U.S. intelligence community are convinced is a deliberate campaign of misinformation. Through what means? By largely spreading false narratives, false hypotheses, bogus news story, fake news, and this is so. What I wrote about almost 3 years ago now, originally about Russians, creating some kind of fog of misunderstanding in order to, hide a horrendous deed, which was carried out for reasons unknown, now seems like something that happens all the time now. And so, frankly, what was once a conspiracy theory is now, we live in an age of conspiracy theories. We are constantly skullduggery is being carried out and then obscured by the deliberate promulgation of fake theories.
I do agree with you about this. There does seem to be a campaign to confuse and disorient. And I was recently listening to an interview with the American conservative commentator David Frum, and his theory on this is that it's been a major goal of first the USSR and then Russia since World War II to fracture the relationship between the USA and Germany. And that a lot of the kind of confusion that we've seen in the last few years, this noise, as you say, that's been coming into kind of the public square, has this as its ultimate aim, to try and strain relationships between the US and the EU, specifically though Germany, to the point where they snap, because then Russian influence in European affairs becomes much more prominent again. And I think the recent meeting between the current president of the United States and the Chancellor of Germany was very, very frightening if you consider it in that light. But getting back to the plane, Why do you think they did abandon that theory of the northern corridor so quickly?
Yeah, it was interesting that even before Inmarsat announced their interpretation of the BFO data, which ultimately they decided meant that the plane had to have gone south, the United States officials were, via CNN and other outlets, saying, we think it went south. And why was that? Well, because probably radar would have detected it if it went north. That is actually pretty weak logic. They might have hoped from the very beginning that it went south, or they might have known that it actually went north and wanted to clearly say, don't look north, please. We don't want to get into this kettle of fish. But it is interesting to note that the U.S. had very little to do with this search. I mean, it was a Boeing airplane, yeah.
Most people would assume that if the plane didn't appear on radar, that is pretty strong evidence. But I mean, I think you and I know that it's not as strong as people might assume. But
right.
But
yeah,
what can we say to undermine that assumption that, well, if it's not on radar, then it wasn't there?
Well, this is the kind of question that would be easy to answer if you had any resources whatsoever. I mean, take a plane, fly it from Kuala Lumpur over India, over the far western China region, and see if anybody pings you. See if you get painted by defense radar. And the idea is that it's very expensive to run a primary radar. Basically, you're shining a flashlight into the night. And if you don't think you're going to see anything, why are you going to bother? For instance, the part of China that this route would go over is uninhabited. It has no air bases. China has no air defense assets there. If there was something coming in that direction, there's nothing they could do about it anyway. And they're not in any kind of active state of warfare. So the fact is, it's a vast area, and there's no reason to look, and so they probably wouldn't. But you're right. That people have assumptions about how the world works, and they kind of use it to kind of gut check whether a theory is plausible or not. And so the minute a northern route theory was floated, as it was back in March of 2014, a lot of people said that's impossible. They would have been seen by radar. Well, once you start to dig into the facts a little bit, you realize, well, radar coverage is much more limited than people realize.
Do you think that possibly they did know something was going on, because there was some calls from the ground to aircraft telephone call system that went unanswered. They only did 2 of them, which I've always found a bit weird. You only call an aircraft with over 230 passengers on board goes missing, and you only call it 2 times. But anyway, they called it first time at about 20 to 3, I think, and they called it one more time 5 hours later, and they've always maintained they didn't know it was still flying at the time. But why call it then? Why did they call it 5 hours later?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much about the initial Malaysian response that still is baffling. You know, we don't really know at what point the Malaysian military either looked at the tapes after the fact, or, you know, were aware contemporaneously but didn't say anything. You know, they had to, you know, wake up the head of the ground operations, or the head of the ATC. And most bafflingly, too, recall that when the plane first went missing, air traffic controllers called Malaysia operations. Malaysia operations said, "Oh no, we've got it in our system. It's still in the air. It's flying over Cambodia." Nobody's ever really figured out why they thought it was over Cambodia, because the plane wasn't heading towards Cambodia. The flight route wasn't in that direction. Maybe the system was assuming a Great Circle route, which would take it over Cambodia. I don't know. But these issues remain unresolved, and Malaysia has not been very forthright in explaining them. But yeah, why would they? First of all, if the plane has gone missing, you know, until now, historically, those planes have crashed. That's why it's not answering your calls, because it's not in the air anymore. So why 5 hours later do you put in a phone call? And I mean, I think everyone was pretty stunned back in the day. We forget how surprising it was because we've lived with it for so long. But yeah, it was really stunning and amazing when they announced, oh, by the way, this plane flew for 6 more hours.
Yeah, it was. And approximately a minute and a half after the 2:25 handshake, there was a logon request from the aircraft's in-flight entertainment system. I don't think that's the same as the SATCOM one, which came later. But do you think there could have been a hack from the entertainment system as part of this takeover of the plane? Because the security expert recently demonstrated that this is possible. Do you think that could have been one way that they started this process of taking over MH370?
You know, it's entirely possible. It's always struck me that one of the standout features of the 777 is that it is, together with the 787, the only airliner in the world that you can get into the brains of the computer, like through a hatch that's open and accessible to the members of the public sitting in the cabin. So yeah, you could have conceivably maybe hacked in through the in-flight entertainment system, but you wouldn't have to. We don't really know how it was done, but we know that there's at least 1 or 2 ways that it could have been done.
But to get into that hatch, they would have probably had to take command of the aircraft in some way, because you wouldn't be able to. Do you think you really would be able to slip into that hatch without anybody seeing?
Yeah, I always imagine the 2 guys in the back coming up and saying, "Hey, we want to sit in the front," and then all the stewardesses and stewards run and say, "No, you can't. And meanwhile, the guy who's sitting in seat 3B is like just lifting the carpet and sliding down.
Okay, so a diversion then would be created on the plane.
Yeah, you have to figure that the Russian military operatives are pretty damn good at what they do. I mean, these are people who can poison you with polonium in your tea, or stick you with an umbrella, or bad things happen to these people. You wind up dead in a sealed body bag in your own bathtub.
And we're probably running out of time now, but I just wanted to ask. You were quite optimistic that we'd eventually would find out the truth. Do you think if the authorities do look at the northern route and they find out a few things, do you think anyone's ever going to admit that they took the plane, or we're ever going to find out the reasons why?
I do. I think that you can't keep secrets forever. Eventually, I think often about when they found what happened to the Tsar's family. For decades, it was one of the great mysteries of the 20th century, what happened to the Tsar's family. And eventually, the regime changes, the archives get opened, the mine shaft gets excavated. The people somebody definitely took this plane. And so I think there's people out there who know what happened. I think Blaine Allen Gibson knows what happened. I mean, he's criticized me a lot for saying that, but I think we know who knows what happened. I
know some of the members of the family passengers who were aboard. Some of them criticise you for pointing the finger at Blaine. What would you say to them?
I feel bad, but it to me it's deeply suspicious that Blaine and frankly some of the other very suspicious characters who populate this world have really glommed onto the next of kin and bent their heads, and many of these most outspoken next of kins have bought into these really outrageously irresponsible conspiracy theories. And I think they've been I actually think that they've been prioritized by Russian intelligence to be turned away from the truth. And Blaine has said, Blaine has said that because of attacks by the media, by which he presumably means me, that people have threatened his life. That to me, he's provided no evidence that anyone's ever threatened his life. And frankly, it doesn't make any sense. Why would anyone threaten Blaine's life for finding pieces of this airplane? There's no one who is threatened by him finding debris. In fact, he's been lionized as a hero. He very ostentatiously styles himself as a Indiana Jones character with an Indiana Jones hat and jacket. And he's received entirely fawning press coverage, except from me. And so to plead that he's being victimized, I think is completely outrageous, frankly, and a lie. I think he has lied in the past about how he's found this debris, and I think if the press would do a more responsible job of actually, in reporting on him rather than just blindly accepting what he tells them, that again would help shed some light on this mystery. I think that the press on the whole has done a really terrible job of doing any kind of responsible reporting on the story. And it's a very difficult, complicated, technically arcane mystery, but the press has totally punted. And, if you look at the coverage of the last few months, you see story after story where there seems to inevitably be a paragraph which runs along the lines of, nobody knows what happened to this plane. Theories abound. Everything from it was hit by a meteor to the United States shot it down, or just outrageous, irresponsible theories that in many cases people aren't even actually actively promulgating. But again, we get back to this idea of this fog, this when you have a press which has been brought up and trained to treat all statements as potentially valid, and the press, dare not put its finger upon the balance and say that this interpretation is more likely than the next. You get a very emasculated press which can't formulate any cohesive theory about a story as complicated and fog-bound as this. And so the public is just completely baffled because the press has done a terrible job.
I definitely agree with you there. Thank you very much again for joining us today, Jeff. And I hope that if we do have a chat in a year's time, that it'll be to talk about how we do know what happened to the plane, and discussing things from there.
Well, I hope so too. And it's now, I think, increasingly clear that MH370 is just one part of a massive disinformation war. Frankly, it's like World War fake, you could call it, where the press is going to have to learn to respond in a different way to these attacks on credulity, and I think that the press is going to have to learn how to handle fake news, is going to have to learn how to push back, and that MH370 will be one of those battlefields.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, guys. Well, listen, always a pleasure.
Yes. It was indeed, yes.
Okay, talk to you guys later.
Okay, bye.
Bye.